October 25, 1944, 6:47 a.m. Philippine Sea off the island of Samar. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship ever built, studying the horizon through his binoculars as dawn broke over the Pacific. His powerful fleet, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, was steaming south toward the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf, and nothing stood between his guns and the vulnerable American transports. Then the lookouts reported contact. American ships ahead, about 20 miles distant. Kurita's intelligence officer quickly identified them from their silhouettes. Escort carriers, the small, slow flat tops the Americans used for anti-submarine warfare and ground support. With them were a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, the smallest warships in the American fleet. Vessels the Japanese Navy dismissively called tin cans because of their light construction and minimal armor. Kurita smiled for the first time in days. This was going to be easy, almost unfairly so. His battleships mounted 18-inch guns that could fire shells weighing 3,200 pounds over 20 miles. His heavy cruisers carried 8-inch guns that outranged anything the Americans had. The escort carriers were slow, nearly defenseless, designed for hunting submarines, not fighting surface battles. The destroyers accompanying them were equipped with 5-inch guns that couldn't penetrate battleship armor even at point-blank range. "All ships, prepare for surface action," Kurita ordered, his voice calm and confident. "We will close with the enemy carriers and destroy them, then proceed to the landing area. This will be a historic victory, gentlemen. The Americans have no forces capable of stopping us." His officers agreed enthusiastically. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons and could absorb damage that would sink a dozen smaller ships. The American destroyers facing them displaced maybe 2,000 tons each, with armor so thin that large caliber shells would pass clean through without exploding. This wouldn't be a battle, it would be an execution. And the only question was how long it would take to destroy the American ships before proceeding to massacre the defenseless transports and supply ships in Leyte Gulf. What Vice Admiral Kurita didn't know, what Japanese naval doctrine had never prepared him for, was that he was about to face American destroyermen who didn't understand the concept of impossible odds, who'd been trained to attack regardless of the enemy's size, and who were about to charge his battleship fleet in a suicidal assault that would become the most heroic naval action in American history. Within 3 hours, those tin cans would have his massive fleet retreating in confusion, damaged and demoralized, abandoning their mission despite overwhelming superiority. This is the story of the Battle off Samar, where the smallest ships in the U.S. Navy faced the most powerful battleship fleet ever assembled and won through courage so extreme it defied rational explanation. How American destroyer sailors charged battleships that could kill them from beyond visual range, knowing they would probably die but doing it anyway. How Japanese commanders, confident in their technical superiority and overwhelming firepower, were psychologically defeated by an enemy that simply refused to accept the reality of their situation. And how the tin cans that weren't supposed to survive 5 minutes held off a battleship fleet for over 2 hours, saving thousands of American lives and changing the course of the Pacific War. The ships of Taffy III, the escort carrier group that found itself facing Kurita's battleship fleet, were never designed for surface combat. They were part of the unglamorous but essential support forces that enabled American operations across the Pacific. The 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, 6 Mastrat, Low, White Plains, Collinan Bay, Kikun Bay, and Gambier Bay were converted merchant hulls, slow, lightly armed, and protected by armor so thin it was essentially decorative. Their aircraft were configured for ground support and anti-submarine work, not attacking heavily armored warships. Escorting these vulnerable carriers were 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts, the smallest combat ships in the fleet. 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, displaced about 2,100 tons each, mounted 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes, and could make 35 knots at flank speed. 4 destroyer escorts, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts were even smaller at 1,400 tons, with just 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes, designed primarily for anti-submarine warfare rather than surface combat. The commander of Taffy III was Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, an experienced officer who'd spent the war in unglamorous but critical support roles, shuttling between administrative positions and escort carrier commands. Sprague was professional, competent and utterly unprepared for what was about to happen because no American naval officer had planned for escort carriers to face battleships in surface combat. The scenario was so unlikely that no doctrine existed for it. No training had prepared for it, and the only reasonable response would be to run while calling for help. When Kurita's fleet was first spotted on radar at 6:45 a.m., Sprague's staff initially assumed the contacts were friendly American forces. Then visual identification came through, and the blood drained from Sprague's face as he realized what he was seeing. Those weren't American ships. Those were Japanese battleships, massive pagoda-masted giants that could destroy his entire force without breaking stride. The Yamato alone outweighed Sprague's entire group several times over and could engage from ranges where his ships couldn't even shoot back. Sprague's first thought, which he later admitted in his action report, was that his force was doomed. There was no escape, no help close enough to arrive in time, and no way his light ships could fight battleships in a surface action. His carriers could make maybe 18 knots at best, while the Japanese battleships could chase them down at 27 knots. His destroyers' guns couldn't penetrate battleship armor. His torpedoes, while potentially dangerous, require getting suicidally close to launch. The only rational response was to run, order the carrier south at maximum speed, and hope that some miracle would save them before Kurita's guns finished the job. But Sprague, despite being a reserved, by-the-book officer who'd never commanded in a major surface action, made a decision that morning that would echo through naval history. He wouldn't just run. He'd fight, using every asset he had, no matter how inadequate, buying time for his carriers to escape and for help to arrive. He ordered his destroyers to attack, knowing he was sending them to almost certain death, because dying while fighting might buy his carriers 30 minutes or an hour of survival time. Commander Ernest Evans, commanding the destroyer USS Johnston, received Sprague's order to attack while his ship was already at general quarters, having spotted the Japanese fleet moments after the carriers did. Evans was a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, a Naval Academy graduate who'd taken command of Johnston at her commissioning in 1943 and had told his crew on that day, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody had gotten off, and now Evans had a chance to prove his words. Evans didn't wait for the other destroyers to form up for a coordinated attack. He just pointed Johnston's bow at the nearest Japanese heavy cruiser and ordered flank speed, charging toward ships that could blow his destroyer out of the water from 10 miles away. His crew watched in a mixture of terror and disbelief as their captain steered them directly toward a fleet that included the largest battleship ever built, closing the range from relative safety into a killing zone where survival was measured in seconds. The Johnston's executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, later recalled the surreal quality of that charge. "We knew what we were doing was insane. Anyone with eyes could see those Japanese ships could destroy us without even breathing hard. But the captain didn't hesitate, and neither did we. We armed torpedoes, loaded guns, and charged. I remember thinking, this is how I die, but also thinking, at least we're going down fighting." As Johnston raced toward the Japanese fleet at 35 knots, spray flying over her bow, Evans began firing with every gun that would bear. Knowing his 5-inch shells couldn't hurt the battleships, but hoping to disrupt their fire control and maybe draw attention away from the vulnerable carriers. The Japanese fleet, surprised by the audacity of a single destroyer charging their entire formation, initially held fire, perhaps assuming this was a torpedo bomber or some kind of feint. When they did open fire, it was with a volume of shells that should have obliterated Johnston in seconds. Massive water spouts erupted around the charging destroyer as 18-inch, 14-inch, and 8-inch shells bracketed her. The sea boiled with near misses and explosions, towering columns of water drenching Johnston's crew as they manned their guns and torpedo tubes. Evans zigged and zagged at high speed, throwing the ship into violent turns that kept the Japanese gunners guessing, racing through the forest of shell splashes like a man running through a rainstorm, trying not to get wet. At 7:10 a.m., Johnston had closed to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano and launched her full spread of 10 torpedoes, sending them racing toward the cruiser in the war's ultimate Hail Mary play. Evans then threw Johnston into a hard turn to escape, making smoke to hide his retreat as Japanese shells continued to pound the water around him. One torpedo struck Kumano, blowing off her bow and knocking her out of the battle. Johnston had drawn first blood against impossible odds, damaging a heavy cruiser that outweighed her 10-1. But while Johnston was making her lone wolf charge, The other destroyers were forming up for their own attack. Commander Amos Hathaway in Heermann and Commander Leon Kintberger in Hull charged in from different angles, both captains understanding that their ships were probably going to die but determined to make the Japanese pay for every minute their carriers stayed afloat. The three destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, and Raymond followed despite being even more lightly armed and armored than the destroyers, their captains making the same calculation that fighting was better than running when running meant watching the carriers die. The Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed Sammy B., was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, who'd never been in surface combat before this morning. His ship was the smallest in Taffy 3, essentially a destroyer with half the armament and two-thirds the size, designed to hunt submarines and screen against aircraft. Copeland's crew averaged 19 years old, most had never heard a shot fired in anger, and their primary weapon training had been against submarines and aircraft, not battleships. When Copeland received the order to attack, he gathered his bridge crew and said simply, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Then he pointed his tiny ship at Kurita's fleet and ordered attack speed, joining the insane charge of tin cans against battleships. The destroyer's attack achieved something that surprised everyone, including the Americans making it. They completely disrupted the Japanese formation. Kurita's ships, steaming in orderly columns toward the carriers, suddenly faced torpedoes coming from multiple directions, forcing radical course changes to avoid the torpedo spreads. The neat battle formation dissolved into chaos as individual Japanese ships maneuvered independently to avoid torpedoes, breaking the coordinated approach that would have allowed them to efficiently destroy the American carriers. Hull, charging directly at the battleship line, took devastating fire as Japanese battleships and cruisers concentrated on her. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo struck her engineering spaces, reducing her speed to 17 knots and knocking out most of her power. Another hit destroyed her bridge, killing most of the command staff. Despite catastrophic damage and fires raging throughout the ship, Hull's surviving crew continued fighting, firing their remaining guns at battleships from point-blank range even as their ship was being torn apart around them. Commander Kintberger, wounded and directing fire from the aft conning station after his bridge was destroyed, kept Hull in the fight until she physically couldn't float anymore. When the order finally came to abandon ship at 8:30 a.m., Hull had taken over 40 direct hits from large-caliber shells. Her hull was shredded, fires raged uncontrolled, and she was listing heavily. As survivors went into the water, Hull rolled over and sank, taking Commander Kintberger and most of her crew with her. She'd lasted almost an hour and a half under concentrated fire from ships that should have destroyed her in minutes. Johnston, damaged from her initial attack but still fighting, continued engaging Japanese ships with her remaining operational guns. Commander Evans, wounded multiple times and with his ship shot to pieces, refused to break off the action, maneuvering Johnston to screen the carriers with smoke and continuing to fire at any Japanese ship that came within range. Japanese shells continued to hammer Johnston, each hit tearing away more of her structure, killing more of her crew, but Evans kept fighting until his ship literally couldn't fight anymore. At 9:45 a.m., after taking dozens of hits from battleship and cruiser guns, with fires throughout the ship, most guns destroyed, engine room flooded, and dead in the water, Johnston finally went down. Commander Evans, last seen on the bridge as his ship sank, went down with her along with most of his crew. A Japanese destroyer that passed through the debris field rendered honors to Johnston as she sank, her crew saluting the incredible courage of the destroyer that had charged their entire fleet. Samuel B. Roberts, the smallest ship in the battle, had perhaps the most remarkable story of all. Lieutenant Commander Copeland, charging his tiny destroyer escort toward battleships, pushed his ship so hard that his engineering crew exceeded the maximum rated speed by forcing his engines beyond red line limits, achieving 28 knots from a ship designed for 24 knots maximum. The chief engineer later reported that he tied down the safety valves because the captain had ordered maximum speed regardless of consequences. Sammy B closed to within 4,000 yards of Japanese heavy cruisers, so close that observers could see Japanese sailors on deck, and began firing her two 5-inch guns so rapidly that the crews achieved rates, a fire that exceeded the gun's designed maximum. The forward gun mount fired 608 rounds in the battle, so many that the paint burned off the barrel from the heat. When they ran out of armor-piercing ammunition, they loaded anti-aircraft shells and kept firing, pounding Japanese cruisers with rounds that weren't even designed to penetrate ship armor. At that suicidal close range, Sammy B's guns actually achieved hits on Japanese cruisers because the range was too short for the shells to miss. The little destroyer escort damaged the heavy cruiser Chikuma so badly that the cruiser had to break off action, scoring hits on a ship that outweighed her 10 times, and was protected by armor that should have been impervious to 5-inch guns. Then, Sammy B launched her 3 torpedoes and scored hits, adding to the damage. But engaging at such close range meant Japanese ships couldn't miss either. Heavy cruiser main batteries, designed for long-range combat, found themselves in a knife fight with a target so small and close that their shells were passing through Sammy B without exploding, the fuses not having time to arm before the shells exited the other side. The destroyer escort was being hit dozens of times, but many shells were over penetrations that didn't detonate. Then a 14-inch shell from a battleship struck Sammy B's aft engine room, detonating and destroying her propulsion. Dead in the water and burning, Sammy B's crew kept firing the few guns that still worked until Japanese cruisers moved to point-blank range and began methodically destroying her with direct fire. At 9:10 a.m., with the ship settling and fires out of control, Copeland ordered abandon ship. As survivors went into the water, Sammy B rolled over and sank, her battle ensign still flying. The escort carrier Gambier Bay wasn't as lucky as the destroyers. Unable to outrun the Japanese battleships and too lightly armed to fight back effectively, Gambier Bay took hit after hit from Japanese heavy cruisers that closed to point-blank range. The carrier's thin armor, designed to protect against fragments in aircraft, offered no protection against 8-inch armor-piercing shells that punched through both sides of the ship without slowing down. At 9:07 a.m., after taking over a dozen hits, Gambier Bay capsized and sank, the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire in World War II. But while the destroyers were dying and Gambier Bay was sinking, they were buying time. Time for the other carriers to run south. Time for their aircraft to rearm and launch attacks. Time for help to arrive. Every minute that Kurita's fleet spent fighting destroyers instead of chasing carriers was a minute closer to survival for Taffy 3. The carrier aircraft, returning from ground support missions with bombs and rockets still attached, found themselves in an improvised anti-ship role they'd never trained for. Torpedo bombers that had expended their torpedoes made dry runs on Japanese ships, hoping to force evasive maneuvers that would slow the pursuit. Fighters strafed battleship bridges with machine guns that couldn't hurt the armored ships but might kill or distract personnel. One pilot, completely out of ammunition, made repeated dummy runs on a cruiser, forcing it to maneuver and lose ground on the fleeing carriers. The cumulative effect of the destroyer attacks, aircraft strikes, smoke screens, and desperate maneuvering created complete chaos in Kurita's fleet. The orderly battle formation had dissolved into individual ships chasing targets opportunistically. Coordination was lost, and Kurita himself lost tactical awareness of what was happening across the scattered engagement area. Radio communications were difficult due to the smoke and the distances involved as ships maneuvered independently. At 9:20 a.m., with Taffy 3 still afloat but badly damaged, with American destroyers sunk or sinking, with Japanese ships closing in for the kill, Kurita made a decision that shocked his subordinates. He ordered his fleet to break off the action and withdraw north. The mission to destroy the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf was abandoned. The massive Japanese fleet, having destroyed 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, and an escort carrier while damaging others, retreated from an enemy they vastly outgunned and outnumbered. Kurita's decision has been debated by naval historians for 8 decades. His official reason was confusion about the American force composition, believing he faced fleet carriers and heavy cruisers rather than escort carriers and destroyers. He reported receiving heavy air attacks that led him to believe American fast carrier forces were nearby, and he was about to be trapped. His ships had taken damage from torpedo hits and air attacks, and he thought continued pursuit was too risky. But the truth, evident in Japanese after-action reports and interviews with surviving officers, was simpler and more psychological. Kurita's fleet had been psychologically defeated by an enemy that fought with such ferocity, despite impossible odds that Japanese commanders concluded they must be facing a much more powerful force. No rational commander would send destroyers to charge battleships unless he had significant reserves ready to exploit the destroyer attack. No escort carrier group would fight to the death against overwhelming odds unless relief was imminent. The Japanese couldn't comprehend that Taffy 3 was fighting with such intensity precisely because they had no reserves, no relief, and no hope except to die fighting in hopes of buying their comrades time to escape. The American willingness to sacrifice themselves completely disrupted Japanese decision-making because it violated every assumption about rational tactical behavior. Rear Admiral Sprague, watching from Fanshawe Bay as his destroyers charged to their deaths and Kurita's fleet inexplicably broke off the action, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His ships were still afloat, the Japanese were withdrawing. His tin cans had fought battleships and won, not through superior firepower or tactics, but through courage so extreme that it had psychologically broken an enemy that should have destroyed them. The human cost was staggering. The destroyer Hull lost 253 of her 325-man crew. Johnston lost 186 of 327. Samuel B. Roberts lost 89 of 224. Gambier Bay lost 147 of over 800. In total, Taffy 3 lost over 1,100 men killed or missing from the surface action alone. The survivors spent hours or days in the water, many succumbing to wounds, exposure, or shark attacks before rescue arrived. The rescue operations were chaotic and incomplete. Many survivors were in the water for over 50 hours before being picked up. Others were never found. The Navy's initial casualty reports underestimated losses because many men listed as missing were actually dead, their bodies lost in the Philippine Sea. The final accounting took months as survivors were identified and the missing were confirmed as killed in action. The Medal of Honor was awarded to Commander Evans of Johnston posthumously, recognizing his extraordinary heroism in charging a battleship fleet with a destroyer. Numerous other decorations were awarded to Taffy 3's crew, though many recipients didn't survive to receive them. The battle became legendary in naval circles, studied at the Naval Academy as an example of courage under impossible circumstances. The strategic impact of the Battle off Samar was profound. Kurita's withdrawal meant the Japanese failed to destroy the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf, which would have been a catastrophic setback for the Philippine campaign. The landing areas remained secure, allowing the invasion to proceed. The Japanese Navy's last major sortie had failed, not due to American carrier superiority or overwhelming force, but because a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts had fought with such ferocity that they'd convinced Japanese commanders to abandon their mission. The battle demonstrated that American naval training and culture emphasize aggressive action even in hopeless situations, a mindset that Japanese doctrine hadn't anticipated. Japanese naval theory, based on decisive battle between comparable forces, had no framework for understanding why inferior forces would attack instead of retreating or surrendering. The willingness of American destroyermen to die fighting rather than accept rational defeat was psychologically devastating to an enemy expecting rational tactical behavior. The post-war assessment by American naval historians placed the Battle off Samar among the most significant naval actions in American history, comparable to John Paul Jones at Flamborough Head or the Constitution's victories in the War of 1812. The battle became required study for naval officers, used to illustrate principles of aggressive action, fighting spirit, and the importance of morale in combat. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars for life. Many never spoke about the battle, the memories too painful. Others became active in veteran organizations, ensuring the story remained alive and their shipmates' sacrifice was remembered. Annual reunions brought together the dwindling number of survivors, men who'd shared an experience so extreme that civilian life never quite made sense afterward. The ships themselves became legendary. Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, their names invoked courage and sacrifice in naval culture. Future ships were named after them, carrying forward their legacy. The guided missile frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts, commissioned in 1986, carried the battle honors Samar, 1944, on her hull, explicitly connecting modern sailors to their predecessors who'd fought battleships with a destroyer escort. At the Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C., a granite wall lists the names of Navy personnel killed in action. The names from Taffy 3 fill several panels, silent testimony to the cost of the battle. Visitors who know the story pause at these names, recognizing that beneath each name was a sailor who charged battleships, knowing he'd probably die, but doing it anyway because it was the right thing to do. The Japanese perspective on the battle evolved significantly after the war. Initial reports emphasized successful defensive action against American forces, downplaying the failure to complete the mission. As more information emerged and Japanese officers spoke candidly in memoirs and interviews, a more honest assessment developed. Kurita's fleet had been outfought and psychologically defeated by an inferior force through sheer American determination. Vice Admiral Kurita himself never fully explained his decision to withdraw. Post-war interviews showed him defensive about the choice, citing confusion, damage reports, and concern about air attacks. But his subordinate officers were more candid, acknowledging that the ferocity of the American defense had shaken their confidence and led them to overestimate American strength. The Japanese had expected easy victory and instead found themselves in a chaotic battle against enemies who refused to behave rationally. The cultural differences between Japanese and American naval forces were highlighted starkly at Samar. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized decisive battle between comparable forces, careful preservation of strength, and withdrawal when facing unfavorable odds. American doctrine emphasized aggressive action regardless of odds, willingness to sacrifice individual ships for larger objectives, and faith that courage could overcome material disadvantage. These different approaches produce wildly different results when inferior American forces face superior Japanese forces. The rational response to Kurita's fleet would have been immediate retreat, minimizing losses while calling for help. The American response was to charge, accepting catastrophic losses to buy time for a larger objective. The Japanese couldn't compute this response, couldn't understand why the Americans weren't behaving rationally, and eventually concluded they must be missing something about American capabilities. The legacy of Taffy 3 extends beyond naval history into American cultural memory as a David versus Goliath story of ordinary men performing extraordinary acts. The sailors on those destroyers were mostly draftees, young men from small towns and cities across America who'd been in the Navy for months or a year or two. Facing an enemy with years of experience and ships that represented the pinnacle of naval engineering, they won not through training or equipment but through courage so pure it transcends military analysis. The question that haunts the battle is whether the sacrifice was necessary. Could Kurita's fleet have been stopped through other means? Would the carriers have escaped if the destroyers had screened defensively rather than attacking? The counterfactuals are unknowable, but the decision tree is clear. Sprague ordered the attack, Evans and the other commanders executed it, and the result was tactical victory at horrific cost. The modern U.S. Navy studies Samar not for tactical lessons about destroyer versus battleship combat, a scenario that will never occur again, but for what it reveals about fighting spirit, leadership under pressure, and the importance of aggressive action even in hopeless situations. The battle demonstrates that superior will can overcome superior force, that courage matters more than firepower, and that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to accept the reality of your situation. The destroyer sailors who charged battleships at Samar knew they were probably going to die. They did it anyway because their training, their culture, and their leaders demanded aggressive action. They didn't calculate odds or evaluate whether success was likely. They just attacked, fought until their ship sank, and in doing so achieved a victory that defied every rational prediction. The Japanese commanders who'd laughed at American tin cans learned at Samar that small ships crewed by determined men could achieve results far beyond their size and armament. The mockery died somewhere in the chaos of that morning as destroyers charged through shell splashes to launch torpedoes, as destroyer escorts engaged cruisers at point-blank range. As American sailors kept fighting and sinking ships because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary, the tin cans that weren't supposed to last 5 minutes against battleships held off a fleet for over 2 hours, damaged multiple ships, sank none but psychologically defeated all of them, and saved thousands of American lives through courage so extreme it became legendary. The ships built for anti-submarine warfare fought the greatest battleship fleet ever assembled, and won because they refused to accept impossible odds as a reason not to fight. The battle off Samar remains the U.S. Navy's finest hour, not because American ships were better, they weren't, or because American tactics were superior. They weren't, but because American sailors demonstrated that courage and determination could overcome any material disadvantage. The destroyers that charged battleships, the escorts that engaged cruisers, the carrier pilots who attacked with empty guns all embodied the best of American fighting spirit. Vice Admiral Kurita's massive fleet, which should have annihilated Taffy 3 and gone on to destroy the landing forces at Leyte Gulf, retreated in confusion from an enemy they'd outgunned by ridiculous margins. They did so because the Americans they faced fought with an intensity that violated Japanese assumptions about rational combat behavior. When your destroyers charge battleships and keep fighting until they literally sink beneath them. When your destroyer escorts engage heavy cruisers at ranges where shells pass through both sides of the ship. When every single American vessel attacks, instead of running, you start to wonder what reserves they're hiding, what trap you're walking into, what you're missing about the situation. Kurita wasn't missing anything except the truth. There were no reserves, no trap, no hidden strength. Just Americans who'd been taught to attack, who believed in aggressive action, and who'd rather die fighting than live with having run. That truth was so foreign to Japanese tactical doctrine that it couldn't be processed, couldn't be believed, and ultimately couldn't be defeated. The tin cans won, not through superior firepower or clever tactics, but through courage so pure and sacrifice so complete that it broke the will of an enemy that should have destroyed them. The battle that couldn't be won was won anyway, because American destroyermen didn't understand the word impossible. The Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts rest on the bottom of the Philippine Sea, their crews buried in steel coffins that mark where they fell. They died charging battleships in ships that couldn't hurt battleships, buying time for carriers to escape, fighting to the last shell against impossible odds. They were outgunned, out-armored, outweighed, outnumbered, and outmatched in every measurable category. And they won anyway, because courage doesn't care about odds. Because American destroyermen don't run from battleships, they charge them. Game over. The tin cans won.